Hello everybody, welcome back to BareRose Garage. What are we doing? Well, we're taking a little break here of cleaning shop and getting ready for the No Name Nationals this year. And while we're doing that, hey, let's take a deep dive into Ford Motor Company. That's right, the man who started it all, Mr. Henry Ford. Today, to go into this story though, we got to go all the way back to the beginning. So bear with me, here we go. Let's talk about Ford. To start the story off, we got to start back at the beginning, back in 1876, with two guys named George. Huh? I thought we were talking about Ford here. That's right. Two guys named George. One of them, George Eastman. The other one, George Sheldon. Now, who are these guys? George Eastman was the inventor of the mobile camera. Huh? What the hell's this got to do with anything? Bear with me. Kodak. That's right. He invented Kodak and the mobile camera. Who was George Sheldon? That was his patent lawyer. They all got together and in 1876 went to the World's Fair in Rochester, New York. Now, at that World's Fair, a guy by the name of Carl Benz was showing off his invention that changed the world. That's right, Carl Benz of Mercedes-Benz invented the automobile. And he showed it off to the world at the World's Fair in New York in 1876. Now on that day, those two Georges took one look at that, and George Sheldon said, hey, there's something in this. Then they went home and they changed the design just enough that Mr. Sheldon got the patent on it. What did he do to change the design? Well, Carl Benz's car had 3 wheels. George Sheldon's car had 4 wheels. Oh, big change, huh? I know. Also, there was another minor change. Sheldon's car had an enclosed crankcase. Now there's a big missing part in this story that I'll get to here in just a bit. Now, what he did is he ran right down to the patent office and registered it. He got his patent approved. Then what he did with that is he got together with his good buddy Mr. Kodak there, George Eastman, and they formed the American Automobile Manufacturing Corporation, the first car company in America. Now here's the catch on it. It was all nothing but a group of lawyers put together to protect Sheldon's patent on the automobile. They never built a working model. That's right, the first American car company in America never built one car. All it was a group of lawyers protecting the patent on the automobile. Now, the reason that they did that is because if you wanted to build a car in America, you had to pay them for the rights to use the patent, plus you had to pay them royalties on every car you put out. And he was a good lawyer. He put in there that any car you anticipated on selling. Yes, he was it was a different time back then, but yeah, they were kind of sneaky. So, yep, the first car company in America never built one car. It was just a group of lawyers. The first corporation never built a car. Never even had a factory, just an office. So, then we skip over to 1901. Mr. Henry Ford, a dairy farmer from Michigan, comes onto the scene. He just got his degree from Michigan State University, I believe it was. Anyway, in mechanical engineering. And he took one look at these newfangled toys for the rich. Why were they toys for the rich? Because by the time you paid for the Sheldon patent, you had to charge so much money that nobody else could afford them. Anyway, he took one look at that and said, hey, that's pretty doggone cool. I can build that, and I can build it cheap enough that anybody can afford it. That was Ford's whole mantra. So he started building his own cars and selling them here and there. Well, Sheldon come a knocking and said, hey, buddy, you owe us a ton of money because you're not paying for the patent on this, and you've sold a few of these. You owe us some back pay. Well, Henry Ford, being Henry Ford, said, kick rocks. This is mine. This is my design. It's got nothing to do with you guys, and you're a bunch of crooked lawyers. Get the hell out of here. So they did. They come back and they shut him down. Ford lost his first attempt. Now, Ford did not let that get him down. What he did with that is he went out and he challenged the #1 world champion. Well, in America, you know how that goes. We have the World Series for us. I know. I'm sorry, the rest of the world. Anyway, he challenged the world's #1 race car driver who happened to be on the American circuit at the time. I know, Mr. Winton. His name was, I think it was Alex Winton. This goes back a long time, and my brain just don't work too fast no more. Anyway, he challenges the world champion race car driver to a race at Grosse Pointe in Michigan. Now, this just happened to be a sweepstakes race. What's a sweepstakes race? Well, it's got nothing to do with Ed McMahon showing up at your door with a big old check, but a whole lot to do with a big old check. At this time period, horse racing and auto racing kind of went together like cogs on a wheel. Anyway, sweepstakes racing is, well, in horse racing, you have the big three. You have the Kentucky Derby, you have the Belmont, and then you have the Preakness, the Triple Crown. Now, there's a lot of time period that goes between those three races. So, in between, you would have pickup races or sweepstakes races. Now, during those races, it was an open call out to anybody. Anybody could go up and challenge anybody, whoever would accept anyway. And it was a way to legally gamble. That's right. Gambling was highly illegal all over the United States, except where they left racing alone. Also boxing. They left boxing alone too. And you had sweepstakes bouts. That's how Jack Dempsey made his name so famous. He traveled all over the country doing sweepstakes bouts. Now, Henry Ford picked up on this, and he went out and he challenged Mr. Alexander Winton, the world champion race car driver, the guy to beat. And he accepted. Now, Henry Ford went out and he promoted the heck out of that race. He went to every news outlet, anywhere, everywhere, announcing this big event that was going to happen. Not only did he do that, he got a lot of investors involved because auto racing and the automotive world was starting to take off. It was a pretty cool thing. And a lot of people were interested in it. So he gathered up all these investors and everything and promoted this race and had a team build him a car. Fun little fact too, that Ford car that Henry Ford raced on that, what they called the Great Race, like I said, he knew how to be a promoter. He really hyped it up. The first car that he was racing in there was actually fuel injected. Yep, the first Ford race car had fuel injection. A very, very, very crude form, but it was. Anyway, skip out to that. End of that, it's race day. He comes up and they're off. Boom. It's a 10-lap race. By lap 3, Henry Ford is down almost 400 yards. He's almost being lapped. That's right, he was getting his butt kicked out there on this racetrack at a mind-blowing speed of 40 miles an hour. Yeah, racing has come a long way since then. But he hung in there, and he kept going and kept going. And then Winton's car lost oil pressure and broke down. Henry Ford just idled right on by him at his mind-blowing speed of 35 miles per hour and finished the race. He beat him. Anyway, A fun little fact after that, Henry Ford, as he was walking away, he never touched that race car again. He said that was the most dangerous thing he ever did in his life, and he was against racing because it was too fast and too dangerous. When I got lawnmowers out there that do faster than he was going. Like I said, it was a different time. Everybody was used to horseback at the time. So 35, 40 mile an hour was probably pretty doggone fast. Anyway, so what did Henry do with that money prior to the race that he got from all those investors? Well, it's a sweepstakes race. He betted on himself. He's a nobody. I could imagine those were like 21 odds. You do the math on that? Yep, he left that place with wheelbarrows full of money. What he did with that? He took that wheelbarrows full of money right on over to Detroit and started the Detroit Automotive Company. Well, wait, we're talking about Ford. What's going on here? We're missing something, right? Nope, that was his first company with all of his investors, and he started the Ford Motor Company. I keep doing it. The Detroit Automotive Company, and launches with the Model A back in 1901. Whoa, wait, what? Huh? We're missing some years here. Things are getting screwed up. No, it's true. Anyway, and it was offered in 4 different colors. That's right. His investors wanted him to have multiple options, and they wanted to be cost competitive with everybody else. Plus, you had Mr. Sheldon knocking on the door all the time wanting his cut out of it. Well, Henry Ford kept going in that, and he launched his first sales, and the sales were lackluster. Plus, with all of the, you got to pay Mr. Sheldon and the American automobile manufacturer, Almac, whatever it's called. You had to pay them all your profits. Yeah, it was tough to dig out a living out of all of this stuff and keep afloat. And his investors, they got tired of what was going on. And the Model A failed. The Model B, then he introduced the Model B out of the Detroit Motor Company. Changed the name just a little bit. Why is that? Because the Model A failed. Now, these investors are still wanting their money. And Mr. Sheldon's catching on. How many times can you change the name of a company before, you got to pay up on this stuff? So he changes his name a third time on the Model C and changes it to the Henry Ford Motor Company, and his investors said, okay, enough is enough. We need money out of this. Henry, you're fired. They took in truckloads of money and, 3 wheelbarrows full of money, and bought him out and put Henry Leland in charge of Henry Ford Motor Company. Yep, it was a Steve Jobs moment, just like at Apple. He got fired from his own company, actually bought out. So he was forced to kick rocks. Now, this is a fun little rumor of the story, but I believe it's kind of true, and it just kind of adds into, I think it's true. The Model C was coming out. He just got fired from the company. Now, when Henry Leland took over, he gave in to the investors, and they decided to build luxury cars. What is the new car company going to be called? The Model C, the big C. They added Cadillac. Cadillac is born from the Henry Ford Motor Company as he was being fired from his own company. Yeah, you can see the animosity that Henry Ford had against Leland. Another investor in the company was Billy Durant. That's right, Mr. General Motors, the inventor of General Motors. Now, Billy Durant he handled General Motors a lot different than any other company. He seen the writing on the wall as America was turning anti-monopoly and we were going after big business. The way Billy Durant did it is he would go in and he would buy your company. He started with Buick, the #1 selling car in America at the time, and the car to beat. He went in and he said, Mr. Buick, hey, you got a good thing going on here. I'll tell you what, I'm going to give you a truckload of money. All you got to do is just pay me a little, pay General Motors a little bit, and hey, we both make each other money. You stay in charge of Buick and keep doing what you're doing. Mr. Buick said, you betcha. He also went to Oakland, which became Pontiac. Same thing, you're in charge of the company, keep going. And they did. Oldsmobile, that's how General Motors worked. And it's how he got around the anti-monopoly laws. It's not a monopoly if every one of them is their own company under the umbrella of General Motors. Billy Durant was a genius, but another guy that didn't build a car himself. Until, well, he did have a hand in Chevy, which comes much later, and I'll do a whole nother one of these on Louis Chevrolet and Billy Durant and the birth of Chevy, because that one gets a little bit sticky and a little bit weird, and you will learn that the heartbeat of America, it's actually a sad story, but a good story, and I think one that everybody should know. Louis Chevrolet was a good man. Anyway, skip on out of this and let's get back into Ford. So Ford is forced to kick rocks, and he's got 3 wheelbarrows full of money that he just got from all of the investors that bought him out of his own company and changed the name to Cadillac and put Henry Leland in charge. Piss him off. So he goes down the streets of Detroit and he goes up to the #1 builders in Detroit, a little bitty machine shop owned by John and Horace Dodge. That's right, the Dodge brothers. Pounds on their door, and it just so happens that they were working for Henry's arch rival at the time. That's right, Billy Durant. He was building transmissions for Oldsmobile at the time. Well, Henry walked on in there with that and he said, hey boys, you take one of these wheelbarrows of money and you guys build engines, chassis, and drivetrain for me. I'll cover the body. All you guys got to do is build everything else, and let's go into business together. Now, the only stipulation is it's got to be cheap. We got to build cars that anybody in America can afford. Dodge brothers took one look at that big old wheelbarrow full of money and said, you got it. Now, the Dodge brothers had a reputation in Detroit, a big reputation. Not only were they the best engine builders there, but they were the kind of guys that, well, come Friday night, they'd go out and tie one on at the local saloon, have a good old time, and then clear the bar. Monday morning, you'd have to go over there and bail them out of jail so they'd go back to work Monday morning. And then they worked hard all week long. Kind of the way they were. Good old boys, you know. Anyway, they partnered up with Ford. Now, they went off and they introduced to Ford their first attempt, the Model D. Ford took one look at it and said, yeah, build it cheaper. They come back with the Model E. Ford said, do it cheaper. You get where the story's going. Got all the way down to, good God almighty, how about the Model T? And Ford said, let's do it. So the Model T Ford was born, and then they went over to their own, well, it kind of started in the Dodge Brothers factory, but Henry Ford went over and built his own factory and got it all started. And they started spitting out Model T Fords. That's right, if you bought a Model T Ford, you bought a Dodge, but it has nothing to do with Mopar. Sorry, Mopar guys, this is way before that. Walter Chrysler was still building cheap suits. Anyway, we go back in, dive back into Ford now. So he's spitting them out. He's spitting them out so fast that he can't sell them fast enough, because what else happened? John D. Rockefeller happened. He went to court and the judgment came. America was no longer big business. They went anti-monopoly laws across the board. And what fell under that? Sheldon's patent. And Sheldon's patent came up for renewal. American government looked at that and said, you know, that kind of falls into a monopoly. We're not going to renew your patent. It was over. The floodgates kicked open and all the car companies were free and of this weird time period in our history. So you didn't have to pay the patent fees and the extortion of the royalties from the Sheldon patent, the car company that never built one car. Anyway, so Henry Ford goes out and he starts selling cars. Now you got to remember, through all of this, Henry Ford was also a farmer. He had strict and strong farmer mentality. Now if you don't know what that means, farmers are used to being paid once a year, so they save everything and invest everything into the farm. What was Henry Ford's farm? The factory, the company. So he invested everything he could into the farm to get it going. That's when he introduced things like the assembly line. He streamlined that all the way down. And here's a really getter, and all of us Ford guys will go, oh, really? Yes, he introduced standardized parts. His whole mantra was if a Ford broke down anywhere on the road, you would be able to fix it with another Ford. All the parts would interswap. Why they got away from that, I don't know. I have no idea whatsoever. But anyway, yep, that was one of his mantras, and it was all pushed around being able to build cars as fast as possible and for as cheap as possible. And here was another getter. If you couldn't afford a Ford, Ford offered in-house financing. Yep, you could buy it on time if you needed to. Ford was very innovative on all of aspects of the automotive world of cars, building and selling cars. We'll just stay with that because that's pretty much all he wanted to do. Basically, he was building Geo Metros, the world's cheapest car that just sold like hotcakes. So he goes out and he just selling cars and selling cars and selling cars. Now, Ford suffered a little in here. And this is something that goes, it replays through Ford history. Even to this day, Ford suffers from this. He would not change. The rest of the car companies they were introducing new designs, new things, new avenues. Ford was still stuck in the, you can buy any color you want as long as it's black. Why? Because he got a good deal on black paint, and he already lost his bacon on his first company when he offered multiple options. He said, nope, they're all black. In fact, if he could have got away with it, he wouldn't have painted any of them. It's just he got a good deal on black paint. Anyway, so, and it was actually industrial paint. It was made for painting industrial equipment. It wasn't even automotive paint that he was painting them with. But it was a different time, like I said. Anyway, we go into the whole politics of Ford, but yeah, he kept everything in line. Now, one thing I do have to bring up through this is, yes, the labor unions were coming around, and Henry Ford stayed one step ahead of the labor unions. How was he able to do that? Well, they came in and they told him, hey, your workers in here are working hard. We're a labor union. We're going to ensure that they are paid right. We're going to offer them, make sure that they're paid $3 a day. Henry Ford said, that ain't going to work. And they said, why is that? He said, because I'm paying them $5 a day. And they said, damn it. Okay, we're going to ensure that your employees are taken very well mentally care of with offering them days off. And Henry Ford said, well, I already did that. I implemented the 40-hour work week. Damn it. So and then when they tried to fire back with him again, he says, I'm offering them paid vacation. That's right, I'm going to pay them not to work. Dang it. They got to get in there. Well, they kept trying and kept trying and kept trying, but Henry stayed one step ahead of them by offering his employees more than what the unions were trying to get. But the unions were relentless, and they staged protests out in front of his factories and all kinds of stuff like that. So Henry Ford's answer to that, and this is a big one that follows the rest of Henry Sr.'s life, again, he went down to the streets of Detroit and found the bare-knuckle boxer champion of the world and hired him as his chief negotiation officer. Yeah, you can kind of see how Henry Ford liked to negotiate when you hire the world champion bare-knuckle boxer as your chief negotiation officer. Yeah, Henry started to get a little bit violent at this time. Anyway, we'll skip all of that. I mean, that's a story all in its own, and I recommend if you're into this kind of stuff, check it out, because whoa, early car history, well, if you like Game of Thrones, Game of Thrones ain't got nothing on early car history. Check it out. It is really cool. Anyway, so Henry Ford keeps doing what he's doing. He won't change nothing. He wants to keep the Tin Lizzy going with just the Model T. Now, everybody said it rode like riding in an old milk bucket. That's where the term T-bucket comes from. Model T, and it rode like you're riding around in an old milk bucket. So he kept everything the same. Always, always, always. He didn't want to retool because that would cost more money. He'd have to raise the price of the car. His whole thing was cheap cars sent out to the masses that anybody could afford. So he just kept going with that. Well, sales started to slump a little bit, and the other car companies were catching on with this cheap stuff, and they were coming up in the ranks and starting to even get close to competing with him. So stock started to drop. Now Henry took this as his cue. All this time, while other car companies were spending their money in different ways, let's just say, Henry Ford saved all of the money that he didn't invest right back into the company. And what he did with it was a little bit controversial, but it worked. He was always afraid of the corporate structure being able to come in and take his company away from him again. So what he did is he took his 20-year-old son, Edsel Ford, and put him in charge of the company, made him president of the company. Now, as a side note, Edsel Ford and John and Horace Dodge were very close. They were extremely close. But Henry Ford was, well, let's just say he would have never won Father of the Year. He was a very big, firm believer in tough love. Probably why he named his son Edsel. Kind of a Johnny Cash boy named Sue kind of thing, if you ask me. And it's the reason I really like it. If you know my real name, you'll know why guys like me kind of like, guys with weird names like Edsel. Anyway, Edsel Ford is put in charge of Ford Motor Company. Stocks tanked, and Henry Ford did it on purpose. So he took that as his opportunity to buy out the Dodge brothers. That's right, he kicked them to the curb. These kind of days, like I said, it'd be called what we call a hostile takeover. He went in, bought them out, and fired them. Now, before you go thinking, oh my God, Henry Ford is tyrant, he just fired these guys out of nowhere and kicked them to the curb. No, he bought them out, and he bought them out for even though the stock was down, it was a substantial amount of money. It was enough money for the Dodge brothers to go off and start their own company, the Dodge Brothers Corporation. And on a fun note too, they tried to bring Edsel with them. They wanted Edsel Ford to be their designer and partners with them. But Edsel being, it's my dad, I can't leave him, it's my dad's company, and I'm scared the hell of him. He'll beat the hell out of me if I do leave, so I can't, guys. Anyway, so Edsel stayed with Ford. Understandably, kind of, I guess. Anyway, like I said, read that story. That gets really... Yeah, Henry was like I said, he never would have won Father of the Year. Anyway, so he used his son as the pawn to knock out not only the Dodge brothers, but all the major stockholders in the Ford Motor Company. Now, what Henry did with all that stock is he spread it out throughout the family. And to ensure that no matter what, as long as Ford Motor Company is in business, a Ford will always be in charge of Ford Motor Company. Nobody's going to take it from me after this. He'd already been through all of that. And oddly enough, to this day, a Ford is still in charge of Ford. It's still a family-owned business. Kind of like a kingdom, though. You kind of see it. It's kind of like a monarchy, whereas General Motors is kind of like the United States. You know, they're more flexible. Ford, on the other hand, one car, one model, one way, my way, the highway. You know how it goes. Anyway, so Ford kicks out the Dodge brothers. Now, a little bit of Dodge history here that I got to get into, because this still plays in with Ford. The Dodge brothers go off and they make their own car. Now, the Dodge brothers did it with two models, only two models of cars. But Dodge was smart. They tapped into a wide open market. They tapped into the truck market. The truck market was still the wild, wild west. And they seen the hole needed filled, and they did it. And they did it with the best trucks in America at the time. Now, also at this time, we were gearing up and for World War I. Yep, the first war. That had been going on in Europe already for a very long time, and the Dodge brothers seen the writing on the wall. Now, also during this time, a little thing called the Mexican insurrection was going on while World War I was, breaking out. And what was the Mexican insurrection? Well, that's when Poncho Villa was going from the northern Mexico into he jumped the border, let's just say, and he kept jumping the border back and forth and doing his little raids, he was trying to change the government in Mexico. He was a revolutionary. Go read the Poncho Villa story. Anyway, the U.S. government cracked down on it, and they sent General Jack Black Pershing down to stop that. Now, Pershing seen the writing on the wall. They tried and tried and tried to catch Poncho, and they couldn't do it. The Spanish horses, the Mexican horses, they were just too fast, and they were all mobilized. They were all expert horsemen. They couldn't catch them. So Pershing went to the Dodge brothers, and he said, hey, look, it's time for us and the military to get with the 20th century. Mr. Dodge brothers, I want 20 command vehicles, 20 of your cars, and 200 of your trucks. And we're going to mobilize the U.S. infantry. Dodge brothers said, you got it. So, in this time period, well, the U.S. military wasn't exactly what it is now. It wasn't quite as professional standing army like you think of nowadays. Generals kind of had the ability to kind of do what they wanted to do when it comes to stuff like this. Anyway, General Pershing orders these vehicles from the Dodge brothers, and they grab, and then he takes and puts a colonel by the name of George S. Patton in charge of the mechanized infantry to chase down Poncho Villa. And Colonel Patton, he chases down some of Poncho's lieutenants, or the upper command guys, surrounds them in a ranch house, gets them, and well, Patton, being who Patton was, he strapped him to the fenders of the car like a deer hunter would that just got his trophy deer. and drove him back and showed him off and took pictures posing next to him like I said, like a hunter posing next to his deer. Anyway, that sealed the deal. General Pershing went to the government and said, we need these. We need to mechanize the United States military with the mechanized infantry. The government seen what was going on in Europe. We were slowly being pulled into the World War I. So the government said, you got it. Dodge Brothers got the first military contract. That's very key and very important. So now we go into World War I. The war finally does break out. There was a movement in America called the pacifist movement going on at the time. Now don't get this confused with the hippie movement of the 60s. This has nothing to do with peace and love and all that stuff. It was just the majority of Americans that did not want anything to do with the war. We didn't want to be drug into it. That was Europe's problem. That has nothing to do with us. There was a lot of people who were involved with, like I said, the pacifist movement. Two of them, Henry Ford and Billy Durant, did not want anything to do with the war. The Dodge brothers, they got the military contract. So every ambulance, every truck, everything military, mechanized military wise, was supplied by the Dodge brothers. And they, at the end of the war, they got a big old fat check from it, from their military government contract. And they secured it by going one step further. The United States Post Office, anything, milk delivery trucks, anybody out there that needed a good, reliable truck or pickup bought a Dodge Brothers. And Dodge kicked Ford off of the #1 spot and became the #1 selling car company in America. Not with their cars though, it was with their trucks, the truck division. Anyway, so another little side note that comes back into Ford play here. Henry Leland, the guy that kicked Henry out, he took over from him when Henry was removed from his first company. Yeah, that story there. He was a patriot. He had English descent, and England was in trouble in World War I. He wanted to take Cadillac and push it and join the war effort, use Cadillac's manufacturing abilities to join the war effort. Well, Billy Durant, like I said, was a member of the pacifist movement at the time too, and wanted nothing to do with the war. He figured that if the GM, motor division vehicles, he didn't want blood on them. Let's just say that. Well, this pissed Leland off, and he quit. And he went and he started his own company, and he named it after Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln was born. Well, bad things happened right after this, and we all know what the bad things are. The Great Depression hits. Lincoln struggled. It was a brand new company, didn't have a whole bunch of sales history, and they struggled all the way through the Depression. All the car companies did, except for the Dodge brothers. Dodge brothers actually fared pretty well because of their government contract, which will come into play into the Ford story again here in just a bit. Now we jump over to Ford again. The Ford Motor Company, he just keeps building Model Ts. Nothing has changed. Same thing over year after year after year. Same car. And Edsel is really trying to convince his old man to bring some style into the cars, change them just enough to make them new. Nobody's going to want to buy a brand new Ford if it's the exact same thing as it was the year before. Henry would have none of it. He wanted to build exactly the same thing. If it's not broke, don't fix it. And he kept, but it was getting broke by this time. People were getting a little tired of the Tin Lizzy. Anyway, skip through it here. The Great Depression is hit. Now, Edsel Ford, he's seen what General Motors was doing over there. Not only was it a way, the General Motors business structure of all of these independent car companies all working together as one under the umbrella, they also had multi-tier marketing. Now at the top you had Cadillac. If you had the luxury money to spend on anything and everything, you bought yourself a Cadillac. If not, well, if you couldn't quite afford a Cadillac, you bought a Buick, which was also their performance model at the time. If you couldn't afford a Buick, you bought an Oldsmobile. If you couldn't quite afford the Oldsmobile, you bought a Pontiac. You know how it goes, all the way down to the bottom line, which is Chevy, which wasn't out at the time, but we'll get into that later. Edsel Ford seen the writing in that and seen the benefit in that, but his dad was having none of it. But I could tell that he was kind of thinking about it. Now, Edsel was also smart. He knew his dad, and he knew his dad very well. He knew his dad's hatred, deep and intensive loathing for Henry Leland, the guy that got him fired from his own company and took over, and then took Henry Ford's vision of the car company and spun it on its head and started building luxury cars instead of cheap cars that anybody could afford. Leland went bankrupt. Lincoln went bankrupt. So, Edsel seen his chance here. So he went to his dad and said, "Hey, Dad, look, Lincoln's out of business here. They're bankrupt. We can buy them for pennies on the dollar for everything. It's your chance to get your revenge on Mr. Leland." Henry Ford gave in. I don't think it took too much convincing myself, but he offered, at the time, I think it was $40 million. And he was the only bid for all the assets of Lincoln Motor Company. The bankruptcy judge stepped in and said, "No, Henry, that is way too low. You have to double that," and made Henry pay $80 million for all of the assets of Lincoln. Now at the time, that's still a very substantial amount of money. We're talking probably billions nowadays, but yeah, you know how inflation and all that stuff works. Anyway, it was secretly said and mentioned that Henry said, "I would have actually paid $100 million if they would have drug Leland out into the street and beat him silly." I don't know if that's true, but it kind of throws a little flavor on the story, I guess. Yeah, the two did not quite get along. Anyway, what was Henry's first act of executive order for Lincoln Motor Company? Well, he sent his chief negotiator, you remember from the earlier part of this story, over and had Henry removed. Mr. Henry Leland was removed from his office, this part is true, drugged through the factory, kicked the door open, and threw him out and fired him. Didn't even let him go back in and collect the things out of his desk. That part I know is true. Yep. They were done. So, Lincoln becomes a part of Ford. Now, you either have the base model Ford of, the car that anybody could afford, or boom, luxury. There was no in between. Now at this time, Edsel is starting to be able to stand up to the old man and get his points across to him. Because after all, he's supposed to be in charge of the company, Edsel is. But the old man is still ruling behind the curtain. But Edsel introduces, because they need a middle ground now, the Mercury. The Mercury is born. So now you have the bottom, the middle, and the top marketing. He's trying to follow the, like I said, the GM marketing model of having multiple brands within a brand. Problem is though, Ford is owned by Ford. It's all Ford. So all of that falls into, one actual company. Unlike GM, where each one kind of helps each other, in Ford, every one of them only helps the one structure. You get what I'm saying. They're all actually controlled by one division. So, what did Henry also acquire with the acquisition of Lincoln? Two things. All of the design and all of the assets of Lincoln and Henry Leland came with the purchase of Lincoln. Now with that, Ford launched into their new and finally broke into the 20th century, if you will. They finally changed and brought back into their new model, which they dubbed the Model A. That's right, the reintroduction of the Model A came to the Ford. Henry brought it back full circle. Now with it, Edsel really wanted to bring in the V8 with the new Model A. Henry would have none of it though. He was afraid of the cost. He was afraid it would cost too much and people wouldn't be able to afford it, which was, like I said, Henry's whole mantra. And he really actually fought the introduction of the Model A as well. He was very afraid of changing anything, and especially the cost. But Edsel, in 1932, he snuck around his old man and introduced the V8 option in 1932. That's right, in 1932 you could get the flathead V8 in any Ford as long as you ordered it that way. And it took off. People loved it. That little 75 horse, I know it wasn't much horsepower, but compared to what they did have, it was quite a bit of a jump in what they did have in the Model A. So, it was rumored to have said that you could have heard Henry Ford scream all the way from Fairlane Avenue. Yep, that's where the Ford estate was at the end of Fairlane Avenue. Anyway, you could hear him scream all the way when he heard that Edsel had gone behind his back and allowed the V8 into the car. And not only that, Henry Ford was afraid they'd be too fast, because 35 miles an hour, that's too daggum fast for the people to be moving. Anyway, so the Model A was born, the flathead V8 was born. Now, 1932, we could kind of see the writing on the wall that was coming also with all of this. Worlds were changing and we were starting to push towards World War II. Now, Edsel took a page from his good friends John and Horace Dodge and went to the US government and said, hey, look, I've got the largest manufacturing plant in America, Ford Motor Company. We all know things are going to break out here real soon, and when it does, you have full reign of my factory. Ford Motor Company is here if you need it. They said, we'll keep you in mind. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, boom baby, we're in World War II. Like it or not, the government jumped over and said, hey Ford, we're going to take you up on that. They shut down all production and started spitting out tanks like they were spitting out Model Ts, just as fast as they could do it. Yep, Ford got their military contract. Now, Everybody knows, you know, during World War II, everything shut down. Well, that's because everybody's seen the writing on the wall, because we had already gone through that with World War I. Luckily in World War I, though, it was very brief. What happened was, well, we experienced our first rationings and drastic shortages of stuff. So every other car company knew that if you didn't do this, well, you went out of business. So everybody scrambled for the war effort, to contribute to the war effort. Most everybody made it. Now, the reason that Ford was able to get it was another bitter tragedy that happened just prior to this. Tragically, I don't remember which one it was. It was either John or Horace died first of the Dodge brothers. He contracted the Spanish flu, and it took him. And shortly after that, his brother died as well. Some say that he drank himself to death over the grief of the loss of his brother. He died of cirrhosis. Others say it was from the lifestyle that they led. You know, people talk. Anyway, within the year, both brothers were dead. Now, they were an opening company. They were first starting company. They weren't very well established yet, so they didn't have an end game in any of this. They didn't have a way to move the company on if they were no longer there. So their wives took over, and they hired people that they probably shouldn't have ever have hired. And they embezzled the heck out of the company, and they took Dodge from being the number one straight to the bottom within 2 years, and Dodge was no more. Now, there was another guy that emerged on the scene who had just left GM. He's the guy that was responsible for streamlining GM into what Ford Motor Company was, and his name was Walter Chrysler. He was the director of operations for General Motors. Like I said, he's the one that got him into the assembly line and all of that stuff. Like I said, everything that Ford was doing, Walter Chrysler did for General Motors. Started with Buick, and then he went all the way through all of them and brought them up to speed so they could build cars just like Ford was, you know, just as fast. Well, Walter Chrysler just left, and well, he was starting his new company, and he wanted that military contract that Dodge already had. So the first thing he did was he bought the Dodge brothers out, and Dodge became part of Mopar under Walter Chrysler. And then Chrysler, they needed a middle one in there because Dodge was going to be their bottom line, their middle car, Plymouth, then Chrysler. And then they switched roles back and forth, you know, on who's on the bottom, who's in the middle, blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. But Chrysler was just starting. They were the little guys that were just getting their feet wet and starting to get rolling. Bang, World War II breaks out. And the government needs people who are already established, and they went to the number one manufacturing company who had already approached them anyway, being Ford. So Ford got the military contract first. And they jumped right in and started building tanks just as fast as they were building Model Ts and Model As. Then tragedy struck again. Edsel Ford died of stomach cancer in 1941, right after the breakout of the war, leaving Ford in turmoil. So the U.S. government, who Henry II, who just so happened to be in the Navy at the time, the government said, hey, you need to do your service here over in your company to make sure you guys can keep spitting out tanks just as fast as you were spitting out Model Ts. And they allowed Henry II to pick anybody from all of the branches of the service to keep this up and going. And he did, and it was called the Whiz Kids. Fun little fact is, that's where Robert McNamara came from. The guy that was ordering the bombings in North Vietnam and, well, in Cambodia. Yep, he was a whiz kid who started at Ford Motor Company. Anyway, so they grabbed Henry II and put him back in stateside at his family business in order to keep pumping out tanks just as fast as they could and other things for the war. In the meantime, the crazy old man, the Mad King, Henry Sr., took back over the company. While Henry II his grandson, is being brought back up to speed. Now, during the war, a lot of weird things happened. There was a lot of cross-pollination, I guess you could say. A lot of companies were building for a lot of other companies. Like, you've all heard the story, you know, you buy an M1 Grand from World War II and you look at it and it's made from Singer sewing machines. Yep, stuff like that happened. So there was no real, this design is mine, this design is yours. You know, that was all kind of put on a shelf during those times. One emerging company that was coming up through that, they got the military contract on the light utility vehicle. Willys and the Jeep. The Willys Jeep, that's right. Little four-wheel drive, little military recon and little light quick vehicle. Well, the problem was Willys was a micro company. I mean, teeny tiny. They couldn't keep up with production, so Ford took over and built Willys Jeeps for Willys to put out to the war effort. Now, the reason I bring this up is because in 1928, just prior to the war, Willys invented something that changed the automotive world. And to this day, we owe everything to Willys. Willys invented pressurized oiling system. Every vehicle now uses it. What it basically did was, it's a pressurized oiling system. So on those, you guys all know, but for those of you who don't know, your crankshaft rides inside of the Babbitt bearings, right? Well, on a pressurized oiling system, it's actually riding on a film of oil, a very, very small film, but a pressurized oil. That decreases friction like no tomorrow. Plus, it makes them very, very durable because your crankshaft is never coming into contact with the bearing, a Babbitt bearing. We all know that when you pull your crankshaft or your rod bearings, because those are all Babbitt bearings, you're looking for copper. What does the copper show? That's where the Babbitt, which is I think it's actually pewter. It's like a lead tin metal alloy that covers the bearing. Every time that the metal comes into contact with the metal, it wears it off a little bit, all the way down to the copper alloy that's down underneath. Now, on a pressurized oiling system, like I said, it's made so it never comes into contact. That's how you can tell if your bearings are starting to go. And it's places where it's losing a little bit of oil pressure and allowing that metal-to-metal contact. Willys is the one that figured that out. So their rods and their crankshafts are actually floating on that film of oil, making them last forever. Well, 3 times as long as everybody else's. Now, Chevy, GM at the time, they were relying on the flippers. On the ends of your crankshaft, they had like scoops that would come down and scoop the oil and fling it around. And it just kind of flung the oil over to wherever it needed to be. Kind of worked. Ford at the time was using the pump and trickle method which basically means that it would pump it up from the pan along with the scoopers and the flippers, and then it would just kind of let it trickle on down where it needed to be. Very crude. Yeah, kind of worked. No, neither one of those worked. Pressurized oiling system, there's a reason we still use it today. Willy's figured it out. Now, during World War II, there was a saying that came from World War II that is still used today. Now, how did you find out if you had a Ford Jeep or a Willy's Jeep? Because they both looked identical to each other. And the GIs would tell you, well, it's easy. Fords, they're found on road dead. Why is that? Because they weren't using the pressurized oiling system. Fun little thing in there. That's where that little haha joke all came from. It comes from the World War II GIs. The Fords, they used the fling and trickle oiling method, whereas Willys used the pressurized system. So the Willys would keep going and keep going. Anyway, that'll come into play when I'm deep dive into the Y blocks again on when we go into Ford. So Ford comes through the war years as with Henry the Mad King back in charge of the company. Now, because Henry II is still getting his sea legs, or his land legs, I guess you could say, and learning how to run a business of this size. And the war is finally over, so everything goes back to normal. I gotta drag in one more. Also during the war effort, we had a food shortage. And the Department of Agriculture stepped into Ford and said, hey, look, we need tractors. We need farm equipment, and we need it quick and on the fast. Can you guys supply this? And especially the ones to send to Europe, because England had been bombed into oblivion and they needed help. And Ford said, you betcha. The 9N tractor was introduced. Now there's a saying with the 9N tractors that still holds true today. They're too fast to plow and too slow to drive. Why is that? Because Ford just threw their car and pickup engine in the tractor. They didn't do many changes to it at all. They just stuck it in the tractor, boom, off you went. Well, it didn't have enough low-end torque to operate at a tractor speed. Yeah, you know, your normal tractors, they just slow tug along as they're plowing a field. Fords, you had to rev them up pretty good to get them going. Now, Ford screwed up during this time period. On the 9N on all the N series tractors, they copied Ferguson. And in fact, if you see the Fergusons of the same year and you put them right next to an N series Ford tractor, they're identical. You can't hardly tell them apart. And during the war, Ford was actually building Ferguson tractors to send back over to England. Ferguson is an English company, British company. Well, Ferguson invented something that changed agriculture around the world. The three-point hitch, or as it was known back then, the Ferguson hitch. Every tractor out there nowadays uses this system. Well, after the war, Ford kept using it. And they kept using it without Ferguson's permission. And they got bit. They got bit really good. Ferguson took them to court over it. And they won. Now, again, you remember me mentioning in the beginning here, Henry Ford was a farmer. He was always a farmer at heart, and in fact, all through his whole career with Ford Motor Company, he still maintained the family farm. And he was big into being self-sufficient, so he grew all of his own food. He raised all of his beef and meat and chickens and his own milk, his own cheese. He was very into that. Henry Ford was a farmer. He gave in. He caved in. They say this is the guy, Henry Ford, the guy that took down the American Automotive Manufacturing Corporation under Sheldon, the big patent holder that was crippling the automotive world. Henry Ford, the little guy, he's the one that took him down. He gets charged by little bitty company called Ferguson over patent infringement, and Henry Ford backed down and paid him out of court, settled it. But he did throw the deal in there that he'll pay them whatever they want just as long as he keep using it. It was the only time that Henry Ford ever did that. Caved and just, paid them what they wanted. No negotiation. He didn't send the strong arm in there or nothing. He said, yep, I screwed up. Here's some money. Can I keep using it? And they said, yeah, go ahead. Anyway, and it was substantial. Actually, it was the biggest chunk of Ford's war money. All these other companies, they got this big old fat government check from the war effort, and they were able to launch right into post-war. Ford, they lost a big old chunk of it to Ferguson tractors right then or off the bat. Plus, the old man was still in charge, and the old man, he wanted to go back to building Model Ts because Edsel wasn't there no more. He wanted to go back to the way it was. He was getting a little cuckoo at this time. And in fact, if you look at a 1946, 47, or a 48 Ford, and you look underneath, they look identical to all the way back to the Model A. Exact same chassis, exact same layout, everything. They just changed the body just a little bit. They're, yeah, very antiquated. They're out of date, very much out of date. Ford was still running the straight axle front end with the wishbone, the buggy, one leaf spring, buggy spring in the rear end. Yeah, their cars were out of touch with what was going on in the world. Now, that brings us into the post-war years. And 1947, Henry finally passes away. Now, Ford is scrambling after this to try to catch up to the rest of the car companies because everybody else has already had the leg up boost. And like I said, Ford already, they lost a big old chunk of their restart up money, and then they stumbled over their own feet and hit the ground face first with the old man still being in charge and the death of Edsel. Well, in 1947, Henry Ford passes away of old age in his sleep. Ford is released and they're able to join the rest of the world. Well, Henry II is too young and too inexperienced yet to fully take over the company. So he's more of the chairman of the board, kinda, and Ford goes through many presidents of the company during this time period. And like I said, they already lost all of their leadership, so and the new one is he's very inexperienced on how to run a company of this magnitude. So Ford entered the Dark Ages. So that'll bring me into the second episode of this because this is already getting way too long, but that's how Ford started. Stay tuned on the next episode when I tell you how, tell you how Ford launched into the 21st century and with the car that ruined my life. I had to say it. And the birth of the shoebox Ford when Ford finally joined in with the rest. And where things went from there. Stay tuned on that one. In the meantime, get out there and keeps the metal hot. And I hope I didn't bore you too much with this little story time. We'll see you on the next.